Alright, welcome back, A-Pushers. Welcome to another episode of Mr. BAP U.S. History. On today's episode, it's the French and Indian Wars. We're going to go into the causes and the effects of the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. Here we go. We're starting off with a quote today from Benjamin Franklin, Founding Fathers, from the Papers of Benjamin Franklin in 1753. The commissioners from a number of northern colonies began being met at Albany, and considering the difficulties that have always attended the most necessary general measures for the common defense, considering also the present encroachments of the French, came to a unanimous resolution that a union of the colonies is absolutely necessary for their preservation. Colonial unity. Here we go. The Mid-Century Challenge, War, Trade, and Social Conflict, 750 to 1763, sees three significant events changed American colonial life. These are underlying causes of the French and Indian War. The British and the French fight a, quote, great war for empire. They've been fighting for a long time. This is just a continuation of that. There's a surge in colonial trade because the triangle trade is being very effective in generating wealth. This leads to increased consumption and debt. Because of the population growth of the colonies, western migration. People are running out of land, so they move west to find more land, which brings them into conflict with the native peoples. All this leads to the French and Indian War. French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Caused by overlapping French and British claims to territory in North America, specifically in the Ohio River Valley. The French had built a series of forts and allied with the Delawares and the Shawnees. They were trading furs. No French people actually lived there except soldiers who were stationed there for a short period of time. All the rest of the French people lived in New France or Canada. Britain was allied with the Iroquois Confederacy through a treaty called the Covenant Chain. The colonists sent none other than George Washington. That's right, George Washington, to investigate the situation, along with some Iroquois as guides. They discovered the French forces, engaged in a battle, killed a French guy before being overwhelmed and forced to surrender. George Washington led them back, fought bravely, but he had to surrender. This action starts a major war between France and England. That's right, George Washington started a war. On to the next one, the Albany Congress, 1756, meeting in Albany, the capital of New York, with the purpose of bribing the Iroquois to remain allied with the British during the war. Benjamin Franklin attends, and he proposes the Albany Plan of Union, which we saw in the quote, was his quote about the Albany Plan of Union, which called for uniting the colonies under one government for the purpose of defense, Indian policy, and trade. It was rejected by the colonies who feared that it would take away their freedom and they would no longer be independent. That's right, they did not trust the other colonies. They did not want to unite together. Not yet. The Great War for Empire. The French and Indian War spread to Europe, where it became known as the 7 Years' War. Despite some early struggles, the British were able to defeat the French and sign the very favorable Treaty of Paris of 1763. Just yet one other Treaty of Paris. France had to give up French Canada, also known as New France, all French territory east of the Mississippi River, Spanish Florida, and more. This was a very positive treaty for the British people. The remaining Native Americans continued to fight the British. For example, Chief Pontiac led a major uprising in Detroit in 1763, which became known as Pontiac's Rebellion. It was a rebellion against the encroachment of American settlers onto their land. They didn't have their French allies anymore to back them up, but they were not going to give up that land. The British government had to send troops to stop it. This resulted in the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade the American colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. This angered the colonists, who ignored it and continued to move west and continued to come into conflict with the Native Americans, which in turn angered the British people, who were like, we told you not to go west of the Appalachian Mountains, and you're doing it anyway. Grrr. British industrial growth and the Consumer Revolution. By controlling naval trade routes, industrializers in Great Britain by the mid-1700s had become the most powerful nation in the entire universe. I said world, in the entire world. A large part of this was due to the first industrial revolution that took place and was founded in Great Britain. It relied upon mechanical power, water and steam-powered engines instead of human power and animal power. Expansion of credit. They sold goods to the colonists. This was called mercantilism. The colonists grew foodstuffs and tobacco for exile. Again, mercantilism. The Consumer Revolution. Buying manufactured goods instead of making them yourself. That's the Consumer Revolution. This resulted in the colonies and the colonists themselves to be in debt to the mother country, which is exactly what mercantilism is, to export more than you import. But for the colonists, that meant they were importing more than they export, and therefore they were being drained of cash, and therefore they were broke. Or going broke. Struggle for land in the East. Population growth increases demand for land in the colonies, especially along the eastern seaboard, also not along as the eastern coast, close to the Atlantic Ocean. This leads to conflict between colonies themselves, who are fighting to expand north and south. Land on the Atlantic coastal plain in the east becomes too expensive, forcing poorer colonists and new arrivals to seek land near the Appalachian Mountains, out west. Western rebels and regulators. Western expansion leads to conflict over Indian policy, political representation, and debt, period. The Paxton Boys, 1737, Scots-Irish frontiersmen in Pennsylvania massacre natives for their land. That's right, Quakers. Peacetime is over. South Carolina regulators. Regulators. Scottish and Anglo-Americans fight with the Cherokees over land. Regulators demand that Eastern controlled governments provide Western districts with fairer taxation, more representation, and more courts, harkening back to an earlier time, like Bacon's Rebellion, who wanted similar things. The Civil Strife in North Carolina, 1766. Regulators rebelled due to an economic recession and ended in 1791 when the rebellion was crushed by British troops and Eastern militias. Problems of empire continued. An empire transformed. The British viewed the American colonists as foreigners. What? Foreigners. Whilst the colonists viewed themselves as British citizens, equal to their peers back in England. This is very conflicting views on identity. That's going to be a problem. The British didn't view the colonists as actually British. Dun, dun, dun. The cost of empire. The French Indian War left Great Britain in debt, resulting in larger government and higher taxes. The Revenue Act of 1762. It was meant to enforce the collection of trade duties, taxes, and enforce the Navigation Acts, the ones that the colonists were ignoring during salutary neglect. The colonists could only trade with England. That's the Navigation Acts. Britain deployed a peacetime force of 15 Royal Battalions to the American colonists, which also cost a lot of money. British politicians wanted the American colonists to pay for all of this, and rightfully so. George Grenville, and the Reform Impulse. George Grenville, British Prime Minister tasked with getting Britain out of debt. The Currency Act of 1764. It banned colonists from using paper money as legal tender. The Sugar Act of 1764 replaced the widely ignored Molasses Act, lowered the tax on sugar to make smuggling harder than just paying the tax, forcing the colonists to pay the tax. The end of salutary neglect. The end of salutary neglect. The end of salutary neglect. Colonists were angered by these new measures because of loss of money, but more importantly because of loss of power. They began feeling like they were second-class citizens, and then the great British people didn't care about them, and all they cared about was making money off them. Which is partially true. Probably true. Making it even worse, they took away their political representation in terms of taking away their court system. So instead of being tried in the colonies by local juries, people who broke the Sugar Act or the Currency Act were now tried in vice admiralty courts or military tribunals, which governed the high seas and run by British judges who enforced custom offenses and did not care and were not sympathetic to the American colonists, and therefore found them guilty and made them either pay or go to jail. The Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act of 1765 sparked the first imperial crisis. The Sugar Act was not that crisis-inducing, as that it was actually made the sugar cheaper, which was hard to get upset about. But this new tax was to cover the cost of keeping troops in the colonies. It required a tax stamp on all printed items, such as diplomas, court documents, land titles, contracts, newspaper, almanacs, and playing cards. Again, these were mostly non-necessary things or things that people who had money could pay for. It was meant to tax more heavily on the rich people, therefore making it, in the minds of the British people, not that, tough. Benjamin Franklin calls for colonial representation in Parliament. i.e., virtual representation. British politicians argue that colonists have, he asks for colonial representation. The British politicians argue that they have virtual representation and completely ignored him. And then they go on to pass the Quartering Act of 1765, requiring the colonists to provide barracks or housing and food for British troops stationed in the American colonies. This is going to further anger the colonies, and we are deep into the road to independence, as the colonists begin to feel like they're being mistreated and that they're not being treated like British people. And some colonists will begin question whether they should stay with Great Britain or perhaps seek their independence. We'll find out what happens next time on the next episode of Mr. B, AP US History. Yeah. Make sure you like, comment, add, subscribe. Tell your friends. Tell your other friends. Tell your friends' friends. There better be more likes and more comments. Or Mr. B, he's going to disappear. Poof.